I'm Schalischa Petit-De for T&C Media. Today we have a special guest, Kerman, who many know as the author of Orange is the New Black, which is also turned into the successful Netflix series. Piper, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start on with the interview. So first, I'd like to ask you about what do you think needs to be changed about how people perceive prison?
I think that there are two misconceptions that people hold about prison, and they tend to be at opposite ends of the spectrum. One idea about prison is that every prison or jail is just filled with uncontrollably violent people, and that makes them uncontrollably violent places. There are some prisons and jails that are very dangerous, but there are many other environments as well. You know, we have the biggest prison population and the biggest jail population in the world, and so you find very different situations in different facilities. The other misconception about prison in this country is that an enormous amount of rehabilitative work is being done inside American prisons and jails, and that's simply not true. There is some rehabilitative work being done here and there, and some of it is really good, but the majority of incarcerated people who need mental health help, substance abuse help, to further their education, to get job training, there's not enough rehabilitative work being done for the need that exists inside of prisons and jails.
And what would you say is something that you saw during your experience that was definitely lacking in the prison system? Like a service that was definitely needed that was not provided?
Most people who end up in prison or jail lack even their high school diploma. It's one of the reasons that we should work so hard to keep kids who are struggling in the public education system, because when a kid drops out of school, their chances of going into the criminal justice system skyrocket. So one of the things that is very much needed in prisons and jails all over this country is more access to education. There are GED classes in most prisons and jails, but we need better GED training, and we also need more higher education access. We need people to have more access to college classes. And that's not only for sort of hopeful reasons for those individuals. The data shows that people who get access to higher education while they're in prison have lower recidivism rates, and people who are actually able to earn degrees have the lowest recidivism rates.
Also, I would like to speak to you about the overpopulation in prison. What do you think is the main cause of that?
I think the main cause of overpopulation in American prisons and jails is that we are sending far too many people into those institutions for reasons that those institutions can't fix. So we send far too many people into prison whose fundamental issue is substance use disorder. The truth of the matter is that addiction cannot be remedied with punishment. It needs treatment. It needs medical treatment. Similarly, there's far too many people in our American prisons and jails who are suffering from mental illness. And many people who don't get the care that they need in a prison or a jail, they need a very different kind of environment in order to get better or to stay healthy. And so I think those are two of the things that we could do very differently that would lower the overcrowding in prisons and jails, especially jails.
So would you believe that when somebody commits a crime that it would be more fit, instead of sending them to jail, to send them to a mental institute or rehabilitation center for drugs?
I think, there's all kinds of different reasons that people end up in prison or jail. Obviously, some people commit very serious crimes and harm other people, but we also criminalize the possession of small amounts of marijuana and send people to jail sometimes for those reasons. We criminalize poverty in a variety of ways. There are many, many people who are ending up in the criminal justice system because other systems are not working as well as they should, whether that's the public education system, the public health system, access to safe housing. There's a whole host of reasons, people are put into jail for homelessness, and that's not a good solution for homelessness.
What do you think would be the first step to be taken that would have the most impact in fixing the system?
I think the first step to be taken that would have the most impact on this system would be to significantly change the way that we deal with kids who start to get caught up with the criminal justice system. And that includes both the juvenile justice system and also the adult system, because there are far too many children who are being put into the adult justice system, which is a disaster. Everyone can understand that if we're able to create a better path for young people who are struggling, that not only is that great for that individual person, but it yields dividends for the entire community when that person changes their path and gets involved in more productive things. So I think the most transformative thing we could do would be to abolish juvenile prisons entirely and to really reconsider the way that we treat young people when they mess up. And sometimes young people do really, mess up, but we need to think about different ways of holding people accountable in the community.
When I read your book, I noticed that there was a section where you talked about some of the younger inmates that were there, and specifically you called them eminent. With your experience with them, what did you see change within them while they were there in prison?
I think that's one of the biggest lost opportunities in many prisons and jails. So sometimes we send young people to prison or to jail, and there's nothing happening within those institutions that helps them get on a better path. So it's almost like a wasted opportunity. Females in the prison system, women and girls in the prison system, are particularly neglected in terms of getting all the access they need to rehabilitation and new opportunities. And that's because women are rarely incarcerated for violent crimes, and they're less inclined to use violence while they're incarcerated. And so systems direct their resources in other ways towards men and boys in the system. And this is, really a significant problem. I think, frankly, there's often not a really strong reason to incarcerate a young person. If there's any alternative, if there's any way that a person can be held accountable in the community and still, have public safety, that's what we should do.
And going off of the differences with how men and women are treated, what would you say is some drastic thing that you've noticed, especially with resources specifically?
Well, I think the most drastic difference when you think about the incarceration of men and the incarceration of women, those things have to do with reproductive justice, with pregnancy, with access to children. I mean, that's important to both mothers and fathers. But the majority of incarcerated women are moms, and most of those moms are the moms of kids under the age of 18, and those women are disproportionately the sole head of household. So women's incarceration, some of the most important issues or the biggest differences between women's incarceration and men's incarceration have to do with children, or again with pregnancy. So at any given time, about 10% of female prisoners are pregnant. And prison is not a good place for a pregnant person. And women should be able to be pregnant and to have their babies safely and out of prison or jail.
A portion in your book, again, you spoke about how one of the inmates were pregnant and how when she was giving birth that she was still in handcuffs. Could you talk about that experience and the emotional effects that it has on people seeing that and also on the mother?
Yeah, it's really disturbing to see how pregnant women are treated in many prisons and jails. They're frequently shackled during their pregnancy at one point or another. For example, if they're being transported out of the prison or jail for a medical appointment, they'll be shackled heavily. And one of the most disturbing things that happens in many places all over this country is that women may be shackled during childbirth, which is barbaric. People from other parts of the world hear that this happens in the United States and they simply can't believe it. There's no justification for it whatsoever. A number of states have made that practice illegal, but what we've found is that even in states like New York, where it is illegal to shackle women during childbirth, sometimes correctional officers are still doing that. And it's hard to really understand why. You have not perhaps, had a baby, but I have, and trust me, when you're in labor, you're not going to run. You're really focused on bringing that child into the world, and that's your only job. That's the only thing you're really thinking about. So, I always feel like the treatment of women and girls in the criminal justice system is a really strong example of how punitive our system is, because the majority of women who end up locked up are there for a drug offense or a property crime, not for the most serious crimes that most concern us. And yet, those systems are very, very punitive against those women. And examples like, shackling during childbirth are a really clear-cut example of indefensible punitiveness.
Why do you think that there is that?
I mean, I think that is how we have built our system. I think that the American system is not really built to rehabilitate. I think there are people who work within the system who are trying to do better. I want to give people credit where it's due. But fundamentally, when we think about what are American expectations of prisons and jails, we are very focused on punishment instead of focusing first and foremost on restoring people who have been victimized. Survivors of crime deserve to have, restoration of their sense of safety and whatever else they need. That should be our first concern. And then the question of accountability for the person who has committed the crime is something that we also need to concern ourselves. But we should think more creatively about what accountability looks like. If the only thing we have to offer survivors of crime are these cages, I think, frankly, we can do better.
And how has obviously the experience has changed you drastically, but in what sense do you think that you personally were affected by experience?
I am a very fortunate person. I grew up in a safe, stable place. Like I grew up with a roof over my head. I went to good public schools. I was very lucky. I was able to go to college. I think I didn't understand how much inequality there is in this country. I didn't understand how many people in this country could not count on those very basic things that I just described. But for many, many people in this country, like a safe place to live is not something they take for granted. Access to education is not something they take for granted. Safety from harm, safety from violence is not something they can take for granted. And those folks who are contending with those things that many middle-class people expect are the people who are most likely to end up being punished in this country. And I think that's the thing that has been most transformative for me, is a much clearer understanding about inequality in this country. And the criminal justice system, unfortunately, is one of the places where we expect that every American would be treated equally, and yet we see very clear examples that that's not the case right now.
So before you were in prison, did you believe that people were all equal? Were you not aware of the inequalities that was present?
Before I was incarcerated, I definitely understood that there were people who were, sometimes very wealthy and sometimes very poor in this country, and that there were middle-class people, and that of course there are racial inequalities, and I was very aware of gender inequality. But I think there's a big difference between sort of knowing the statistics and thinking about those things in the abstract and living that experience side by side. We're a very segregated country. We're segregated by income, we're segregated by race. We are a nation which is not really living in community in the way that we could be and that we probably should be. And it makes a big difference when you stand side by side with another person and understand the ways in which your own life has been different than theirs, and you want something better for them. You want the same things for them that you are lucky enough to have for yourself.
Do you think that you needed this experience? Do you think that if you could go back and to change so that you would not end up being incarcerated, would you take the opportunity?
If I could go back in time and change my actions and my choices, I would definitely do that, because my actions and my choices harmed other people, right? I harmed, my own parents, but also, I made choices that contributed to other people's substance abuse and addiction. And so, of course, I would definitely go back and change that in that respect. I'm grateful for the lessons that I'm able to draw from the experience, and that's something that I think everyone should understand, is that everyone is going to fail and make sometimes catastrophic mistakes in their lives, but it's what you're able to learn from the experience and carry forward in a positive way that will help you be resilient through those tough times.
I would also like to talk to you about your work with students, because of course it's evident that you are going around to many universities and speaking. What is one thing that you think that you should tell students that would impact them the most?
the thing I would tell my 22-year-old self when I was getting out of college is that, your actions and choices matter a lot in the world. And sometimes that's something that young people question because, young people aren't necessarily running universities or in charge of things in every way. But I think it's very important for people to understand that, in fact, you have a lot of power in the world and your choices matter in terms of your own trajectory, but also in terms of the impact you have on other people. And I would say that, young people have a lot on their plate, We have a lot of challenges in this country. We have a criminal justice system that doesn't work as well as it should. We have an environment that we need to protect. We have a lot of things, facing us, but each person's actions matter a lot on those fronts.
And obviously you are doing a lot of things to help to change the systems. What is the biggest thing that you're working on right now?
I mean, right now, the thing that I'm spending most of my time doing is teaching, and I teach in 2 state prisons here in Ohio, and I'm writing, and so that's probably the thing that's taking the most time. I'm always excited to go and talk to young people or to, library communities or to, really anyone who wants to talk about these questions around crime and punishment and justice and what does justice really look like. And I'm always happy to lend my voice to legislative or policy changes that are happening.
I would also like to talk about, of course, the Netflix show that was derived from the book. In what way do you think that the show has helped to change the conversation about the injustices that occur?
I think that the show, certainly what I hoped with the book is that people would come away from the experience of reading the book and be like, wow, I just read a book where the protagonist was a prisoner. I never really thought about the prisoner being the protagonist. I only thought about them being the villain, right? And I think the show reflects that as well. The show puts forward all these different protagonists, lots and lots of different women, and we can all find somebody that we want to cheer for on that show. And I hope that people who are fans of the Netflix series make the connection that, the people on the show are obviously fictional characters, but our prisons and jails are filled up with real people who also have complicated, interesting lives and have a lot to offer. And I hope that people who like the Netflix series, again, make that connection back to the real world, to their communities, because there are people in every, people nearby in jail or in a nearby prison who might be every bit as interesting as the people that you see on that Netflix series.
Is there anybody who has come up to talk to you about either the book or the Netflix series and said something about how it impacted them that really touched you?
I hear a lot from people whose lives have been directly touched by the criminal justice system. So from people who have been incarcerated, from people who have had a parent who was incarcerated or a child or another loved one. And I think for those of us who fit into that category, and there are millions and millions of us, right? We have mass incarceration in this country. We put more of our own people in prison than any society in human history has ever done. So there are millions of people who have been in prison or have had a loved one in prison. And I hear a lot from those folks about what it's like for them to see people who are incarcerated recognized as really being human, as being interesting, as being compelling, as being important. Because I think part of the act of putting someone in prison or jail, it's sort of like this strange dichotomy between, oh, you're so important, you've done something so terrible, we're going to lock you up, and yet also, when we put someone in prison or jail, they basically disappear, right? We've exiled them. And so to sort of see people come out of exile, I think is very meaningful for people who have been directly affected by mass incarceration.
And do you think that the way that people are portrayed as inmates, do you think that that is one of the main causes? Do you think that they're shown as, do you think that there's lacking in showing sympathy and empathy for inmates?
I do, yeah. I do think that people rarely think hard about what led up to whatever crime we choose to incarcerate a person for. People also assume, that everyone in prison or jail has committed, some truly, truly terrible violent crime, when that is not necessarily true. There's many people who are locked up for very low-level offenses. I think that one of the problems with the system is that it reduces people to the crime of conviction and doesn't really acknowledge all of the different things that are true about them. Some of the things that may have contributed to the crime of conviction, and also some of the things that have nothing to do with that crime of conviction that are important or interesting, like a person's ability to sing or to write well or to, grow a garden or, any number of things that people are good at.
And to wrap up, is there anything else that you would like to just say?
I'm just delighted to be here at Otterbein. We've been collaborating with Otterbein for a couple of semesters now. We have really enjoyed having Otterbein students come to the Ohio Reformatory for Women and to Marion Correctional Institution and participate in our classes there. So that has been fantastic for me, as a teacher, and certainly for my incarcerated students. Like, it's really always amazing when people from the outside come and engage with people who are incarcerated, because it's a really strong signal that those people are important.
All right, well, thank you for this interview.
Thanks for all your questions.
I'm Schalischa Petit-De for T&C Media.